Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation on sharing and depositing research data, a guide for researchers. My name is Catherine DeVita. I'm the training coordinator for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here to join us today during this 2025 Love Data Week. Before we begin, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. As we proceed with our webinar session today, it is with the acknowledgement of the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis Nations and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research, and of data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. On behalf of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we commit to understanding and taking up our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. And I'd like to personally acknowledge that I'm working from Montreal, Canada, the ancestral and traditional home of the Kanien'kehá:ka. I'd like to also quickly review our code of conduct. The Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. The discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform. The Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form, and harassment can be understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces the feeling of an unsafe environment. And so we appreciate your help in ensuring that we maintain a safe and welcoming environment here today. I'd like to now introduce us to today's speaker. So Daniel Manrique-Castaño received his PhD in neuroscience from the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum in Germany. Daniel, you'll tell me if I mispronounced that. I'm sure I did. And completed postdoctoral training at the Université Laval in Quebec. His research interests include brain injury, glial reactivity, and spatial data analysis. He joined the Alliance as a curator and community engagement officer in pursuit of his professional goals of promoting open and reproducible science. He has experience in handling and analyzing biomedical data, as well as skills in R and Python programming, statistical modeling, and image analysis. It's our pleasure to have Daniel here with us today.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and I'm happy to be part of this session.
And before we begin, just a quick overview. So your session at a glance today. Research data sharing is a fundamental activity for the advancement of science. In this webinar, the Federated Research Data Repository, or FRDR, curation team will present effective approaches to structuring and preparing research data for sharing in general data repositories such as FRDR. These scientific best practices are key to making research data an autonomous resource that can be understood and reused by the scientific and research community and the public for academic or research purposes. So on that note, I will stop sharing my screen. Daniel, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Catherine. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we see your screen.
Great, perfect. So hello, everyone. For me, it's a pleasure to make this presentation as benefit of the curation team of the Federated Research Data Repository, which we call FRDR, of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. I'm Daniel, and I'm a former neuroscientist, and I recently joined the Alliance as a curation officer. And for me, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you some elementary principles for sharing data in repositories like ours. I want to emphasize that this presentation is available on the web. Catherine will be posting the links on the chat, and at the end, you will also find a QR code with links. You can access the presentation in English or French. And the advantage of this is that you can access several resources that are embedded within the presentation. So I hope that makes sense to you and it's useful for you in the long term. So this is basically our agenda. We will be touching on 6 points, which encompass the principles we care the most at the moment of sharing data. So we can start by the question we can make ourselves: why do we care about sharing data? So I believe that it comes down to a few points worth remarking. First, as a scientist, I believe that sharing and reusing data may help us avoiding repeating experiments that have been already done, and this can save time, money, and why not resources. One can think about, why should we do an experiment I have already access to, for example. In second place, sharing data allows independent teams like yours to verify findings by replicating original workflows. I think that in today's research landscape, this is crucial given the fraud and the reproducibility crisis we are currently facing in science. So we need to be sure that we are providing enough information to make our conclusions reproducible and at the same time verify the results of ours or others' research articles. We can also use data to propose new research questions or even combine information with our original research data, for example. I also think that this makes sharing data makes a fantastic teaching resource for students or early career researchers. And you can think about that your data set can be a data set that you use in workshops or in training courses for different topics. And finally, we can think about raw data as a crucial element, a crucial resource for initiatives like meta-analysis that will run and work better if we can base our conclusions and explorations in reproducible research. In this landscape, specifically in Canada, we can also find the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy, which essentially the government of Canada, throughout its main funding agencies, is committed to promoting a strong research data management and data sharing to improve the return on investment for the public. So I think this agreement encouraged the creation of data management plans, for example, and the sharing of the research data by projects funded by public funds. So this certainly is something that will strengthen in the following decade, and I hope it gets to the point that we as a scientist are obliged to share research data without any excuses. However, I would like to stress that as a scientist, we should not be sharing data to check boxes for grant requirements or to check boxes for journal submissions, but or because politicians that we don't know about say so, right? So I want to encourage you, for fellow researchers, to really think about data sharing as part of our professional and ethical responsibility as researchers. I think this is a great contribution to open science, and I really believe it ensures our research endeavors are useful to other scientists and the community in general. So how does research needs to evolve? First, we need researchers which are competent in research data management and data analysis. We can tell about people with the skills and the know-how to handle data responsibly and effectively. Second, we need standardized approaches to sharing raw data and analysis code so others can verify findings and build on our results. And we can also think about fostering a culture of transparency, best scientific practices, and ensuring that research remain a credible source in the long run. Here we can see some of the benefits for different parties implicated in research, and we can see that the benefits go from efficiency on the side of researchers to open science and return on investment. Now we go to our second point, and I would like to start by stressing that currently in our research landscape, research data could be in many places, usually and more generally in the laptop of students and postdocs, and is extremely likely to remain in those places in the long term. It could be also stored at the institute or university network, why not the cloud in services like Google Drive or Dropbox, or for some scientists in high power computing clusters like the ones that we, the Alliance, help scientists with. But nonetheless, and here we have a strong evidence that although we find these statements in research articles, something like the raw data supporting the conclusions of this article will be made available by the authors without undue reservation, the reality and the data show that that's not true. In fact, most of the time, the data supporting a research article does not appear anywhere. And the reasons are multiple, ranging from poor data management, the data can simply not be found in the laboratory, to cases of fraud when the data does not really exist. So obviously there's nothing to share, just about 10%. So one each 10 times you ask for the raw data really appears. And I think that principles or engagement like the one proposed by the three-agency government here in Canada will empower and will improve the situation. So, well then, in the few cases when the data is shared by request or because we find it in the supplementary information of the research article, we can find common issues 99% of the time. Too frequently, I have seen there's missing or incomplete metadata, and there's no README file that can explain the context, the methodology, or the structure of the data set. And I think this lack of documentation can make it really difficult, sometimes impossible, for others to reuse data. Another common problem is disorganized data structures, which again prevents an easy reanalysis or further reuse of the data set. And finally, we can see that most researchers treat data sets merely as a supplementary material secondary to a research article, rather than recognizing these resources as vital standalone resources that can have a major impact in research and stimulate further studies. So, one of the biggest priorities in the research data management field is to ensure that our data sets are independent resources. And this means making a data set clear, organized, and easy to navigate for everyone who aren't familiar with the data set or with your research, for example. I myself have been in situations when I'm asked to advancing research or take over research done by previous members of the lab, the PhD or the postdoc who left the lab some weeks, months ago, and there's literally no way to understand what have been done. So it's years and resource completely missing simply because the data collection, the methods, and description of the data is not available. Perhaps the person who did the job wants for sure to help, but this person doesn't have the documentation neither to understand or to remember what has been done in the past. And research can take many years, can take in many cases decades. So it is really difficult to keep in our minds what do we have. So to avoid this situation, we need to make sure that the data is understandable from the beginning by providing sufficient documentation. We can find a general framework called FAIR principles that help us to understand many of the variables or many of the characteristics that well-managed data must have in order to be shared with other scientists and the public. And we will touch on many of these points in the following diapos. Very good. So going forward, we will be looking at some general principles for sharing data. And I'm aware that the details may be different, may vary from discipline to discipline, but I do think that these three are, we can say, cross-cutting in all cases and can be applied to whatever field or research subject. First of all, importantly, provide a descriptive title along with a concise summary and keywords that capture what the data set contains. Please, at this point, be aware that the title of the data set you share in repositories is not the same title of a research article or a conclusion-like statement we usually do in papers, no? For the data set, the most important is that the title is related to the nature and the content of the data set. What is the data set? Are there images? Are there videos, table, DNA sequencing, etc.? And we will see some examples a bit later. Next, importantly, include a README file with metadata. Many of you can ask at this point, oh, Daniel, what's metadata? That's simple. Metadata is just data that explains our research data. So the README file should explain the context of the data, the methods used to gather or to generate the data, and instructions to help others to handle the data or to open files. And finally, we make sure that the data is structured and organized, and it's very important to define, we can say, descriptive and logical naming conventions that allow to establish the relation between files. Let's go a bit deeper on those aspects. First, provide a descriptive title, summary, and keywords. Here we can see a couple of real examples from further deposits, the curation job I do. And we can see here a data set that was sent to us with the name Dépôt 2.0. I think that here we can all agree that there's no clue to know what is it about, what's the data set about. And after the curation process, it came out with a more descriptive name, I think. But even by looking at this title today, like today, February 11th, I have the idea of refine it more, perhaps. We can say something like home cage-based motor learning platform for laboratory rodents, people 2.0, for instance, no? The more descriptive the title, the better. And we may ask, can we find the perfect name for a data set? Perhaps not. Perhaps there's no perfect name, but I'm sure that there are better names than others. In the second example, we see that the inclusion of what was mapped and the technique used greatly improves the title and give it more context, and it's easy to understand for the potential reusers. Here in this example, we see that the inclusion of the place makes it specific and allows understanding that the data set is someone related to geography or to satellite imaging, for example. But overall, the important thing is to remember that the title of your data is not the same title of your research article. Both are completely different entities and serve completely different purposes. Now, let's look at the description with some additional examples. You may think that a good description reflects the content and methods of the dataset. Here we can include as many keywords, and I recommend you to include as many keywords as possible to increase the discoverability of the dataset. In this example, we see on the first plate a low informative description that can be enhanced to better inform the reader about the dataset contents. The same happens here. We can include some methods and describe the outputs of those methods, which indeed are the content of the dataset. Again, there may not be a perfect description, but there are certainly some that are more informative than others. And finally, just to remark this point, to find relevant keywords for the dataset, we can ask, what terms can our user use in a search field to find my dataset? This is an aspect to be considered depending on each research discipline, but certainly it should be something specific enough for your specific and descriptive enough for your dataset. The second point to highlight, it's about one of the most important elements of the dataset, and it's the README file. In simple terms, this is a plain text. It's not a PDF. It's not something weird. It's just a .txt file, a plain text file that explains what is in the dataset and how you produce the data. You perhaps know README files after you install software in your computer, and at the end you see a message, do you want to see the README file? And the README file explains what is the software about, what is useful for. So there are several ways, resources, and templates to write README files. Some of them are listed here, but are not the only ones. But overall, we can see that a README file has some common characteristics that are worth mentioning. First, a README file includes dataset identifiers, and this can be the title, the authors, the date of the data collection, and many other relevant geographical or contextual information, which basically helps establishing the identity of the dataset. We also find usually, or ideally better, a file and a folder map, which defines the structure of the dataset, showing how folders, subfolders, files are organized and related to each other. At this point, we can also explain what's the logic of the naming conventions we are using for our files and folders. Ideally, the README file also contains methodological information that details how the data was collected, generated, the tools we use for gathering or for analysis of the data, and in many cases, any relevant or peculiar experimental conditions that can bring more contextualization to the experiment and the data set overall. And here, please remember, here it's extremely important to remember that a data set stands as an independent resource. So this information must not be buried or just included in the associated research article. Many times we receive README files with the statement, the methodology is explained in this article. Ideally, as a standalone resource, the dataset should include also a very nice and complete description of the methodology, so it's not completely dependent on the research article. We can also talk about in the README file instructions and software to provide some guidance on how to open or handle some files in the dataset. This applies specifically when you have extensions or files that are not too well known in the community, for instance. And of course, we also talk about the sharing and access information. It's important that you, as an author and creator of the dataset, clearly state the permissions and the terms of use for the dataset. Are there any restrictions, or is it open for anyone to use? It depends on you, but we always encourage the use of the plethora of CC BY licenses that are useful for almost any situation. Now, let's talk about the third principle, which is defining a clear structure for the dataset. And we can imagine it from the beginning like a Matryoshka doll, no? Where we have files and folders embedded in other more general folders. For some of you, this aspect may sound a little bit trivial. It could be a trivial exercise, but in my experience as a data curation officer, is not. Apparently is not, because more often than not, we see data sets whose structure is not understandable at all. So ideally, structuring a project is something you do right at the start of the research project. If it's not possible for some reason, you can do it during the research course, but in all cases, it is better than not doing it at all. And here are some important things to consider for when structuring data sets. And why did I say at the beginning? Because structuring data sets for sharing in repositories, whatever the repository is, after years, decades of chaotic research data management is an impossible task. Believe me, as a scientist, I know that. So think about folder structures. What makes sense to your project? So should you have separate folders for raw data, for process data, for analysis scripts? Are you labeling the folders and files clearly? Think about also file types and file formats. Decide which file formats are more appropriate for you. Overall, in the research data management field, we strongly encourage scientists to use open formats. For example, CSV tables instead of Excel files, or TIFF images instead of CSRI files from size, for example. Importantly, and I want to highlight this point, pay attention to naming conventions. Come up with logical, descriptive file and folder names. Avoid names like data final 2 that doesn't tell people what's inside that file, no? Overall, here the objective is that other people can navigate the data set smoothly and in a comfortable way, if we can say that. We are going to see some more elements. In general, there's no rule. There's no strict rule for organizing files, of course. It depends on the content, how big is the data set, the discipline, and some other factors we can think about. But I believe this protocol, the tier protocol 4.0, it's a very useful starting point and provide us scientists with a structure that we can further simplify, if that's the case, or develop according to our needs. On the right, we can see an example of a clean data set structure, and we are going to navigate a little bit throughout this structure to take advantage of it and see what we can find. So in this structure, we can recognize a folder with our raw data. And this is extremely crucial for research because the raw data is the data we get from our device, from our measurement device, for example, and has not been modified by us. It has not been modified by the user. Please note that we must always keep the raw data, and the modifications are done completely in a separate file. If we need to process that data, we need to create a new file, and that file will be the process data. But the raw data, the output from the machine, from the device, from the measurement device, should not be never modified. And the raw data may include images, may include tables, even original record sheets, for example, physical record sheets. And I definitely believe that we all scientists are very familiar with these types of files because we work every day with them. As I emphasized earlier, the point of submitting data is to make it understandable to our peers, to other scientists, and to the public, no? And therefore, it is expected that this input raw data is accompanied by metadata, which can be README file-like documents describing what is the content of the images, for example. It could be also code books describing the variables of our data tables. And what I suggest is to find the best strategy that works in your case to provide a faithful and sufficient description of the data. In these links highlighted in the presentation, you can find examples of code books you can start with, for example. Now we move to another kind of data, which is not our raw data, but the data that we have modified in some way to produce what we can call the data for analysis, or the process data. And this is the data we use to produce figures and to do statistics on it. Yeah. So like the input data, we hope that this data is also accompanied by documentation that describes the content of the files, and importantly, how the data was modified to produce this output. And I will add some lines to this later. Cool. I would like to draw your attention to this point in particular. As a scientist, we use tables every day to handle data, but most of the time they are horrible objects to work with from a reuser or a preservation perspective. And these are very good examples or poorly formatted tables. Tables that have combined cells, different variables in a single column, or worst, combined tables and figures. If you access data that researchers share in the supplementary materials of research articles, 99% of the time, this is what you will find, which is data which is not usable at all and not understandable at all, and just submitted to comply with the loose journal requirements. So this is not a good standard. That is not consistent with the open science movement or the reuse of scientific data. On the contrary, and this is an example of a good table, it has no colors. The colors are just to signal the important areas of the table. This is what we call a tidy table. And in short, it just rows contain single observations and columns contain single variables. That's it. This is the gold standard. You don't need a paid software or do tricky things to do that. It's extremely easy to accomplish, and the best of all is the gold standard for tables and reproducible data. Otherwise, many of us who work specifically with microscope images, for example, can also create and of course share intermediate files that we generate along the way, such as, for example, mask we take from images or machine learning classifiers we use in certain software that are useful to create or analysis pipelines or to get results from our images. And I think at this point that the best companion to the analysis files we create, those are the files we use for producing figures or for doing statistics, is the code we use to transform the original raw data into tables we use for analysis. From my point of view, I argue that scientists cannot continue to skip coding as a basic research skill. We spend a lot of time learning research techniques. As a neuroscientist, I had to learn animal surgeries, injections, Western blotting, immunohistochemistry, flow cytometry, things that can take weeks, months, even for some technique years. You can ask a person how long it takes to learn patch clamp, for example, to pinch little cells. And I strongly encourage you that you consider coding as a basic skill for research as other research techniques that you use. So I think there's no other way to appropriate do reproducible science. The best of all is that we have some excellent languages like R and Python that together with the new artificial intelligence tools made this task much, much easier than it was 3 or 5 years ago. So that led us to the processing scripts, which are these files that show how we have modified our tables or our images. And for sure, they can be in different formats, but the important thing is that they provide a way to reproduce the process that we have done to the data. Importantly, please consider that logical naming conventions at this point are the key to link the input and the output data with the processing scripts. Another type of file we can share in a dataset is the analysis scripts, which, unlike the previous ones, which we use to modify files, these ones are useful to generate the final results of our research. So they can contain the specifics of the statistical models and the code to generate the graphs using tools like ggplot in R or matplotlib in Python. In fact, in certain cases of advanced analysis, researchers can share a master script that executes all other scripts in the dataset and provides a full reproducible workflow of the research results. We also find, for example, the results folder when we find objects created specifically by these analysis scripts, which can be again in the form of table, images, figures, and these are particularly extremely useful because, as all you know, as a scientist, we give to companies the copyright of our research material, which is public funded, and in many ways the public and other scientists cannot use that material. So I really encourage you, fellow scientists, to share the images and the results of your research as a sources to promote the accessibility of research, and of course share materials that otherwise will be copyrighted by private companies. So at this point, we can say that sharing the output resulting from computations is one of the best commitments to open and reproducible science.
Daniel?
Yes?
If we can maybe pause here for a sec. I'm seeing we only have about 15 minutes left, and we do have quite a few questions in the chat. Do you think we could address some of these questions?
Yes, of course we can. Yeah, for sure.
Sure. So we have one here from Tomas. So often the description of the method used to create the data set is described in detail in the research paper related to the data. Do you recommend citing the paper for that, or copy pasting research method from the paper to the metadata of the data set?
That depends. I would not recommend to copy paste necessarily the methods, because usually not all the information in the research article it's in the data set, or vice versa. It depends the level of specificity. I mean, we know that research articles sometimes had some limits the researchers can spend in writing methods or text in general, but it could be much more complete in a data set. So in all cases, always remember that those are two different elements. One thing is the data set, one thing is the research article. So I will recommend you can take parts, useful parts from the methods in the research article, but it should be definitely tailored to the content of the data set.
Thank you. The next question is, what is, in your opinion, the best or most widely used approaches to preserving data provenance in modern data sharing frameworks?
I think the best way to do that is sharing that in repositories with very well documented data sets in the repositories, specifically thinking about the long term. If we think about a data set, a repository like ours, further, we, the curators, make our best effort to have data sets very well documented, and then the preservation phase of this data set will ensure that the metadata within the data set can be captured in the best way by different services like Lunaris, which is an instance from the Alliance, or Google databases, for example. So I definitely think that documenting data sets from the beginning and sharing the data sets in public repositories is the best way to do that.
Great, thank you. Just a few more questions here. So do you recommend any coding learning tools?
Yeah, definitely. That's a question depending on the route someone may take. I mean, I want to do coding to handle and analyze data, or do I want to do coding to handle and analyze images? But I think that R and Python are good enough for everything we want to do. I think that R is a little more common in academia, while Python is a little bit more common in industry. But a very nice and easy starting point is YouTube. There are thousands of lessons and courses in YouTube. We also have the carpentries website that perhaps if you, Catherine, have some time can perhaps share the link of the carpentries website that also contains a lot of starting courses for R or Python. And why not? You can use ChatGPT. You can ask ChatGPT to provide you or to give you a course for learning or starting with the basics of R and Python. But I'm sure that with YouTube, there's enough material there. Yeah.
Thanks. Should data be stored in the commercial cloud or on publicly owned or in-house storage systems?
Personally, I always support public, free, open access stuff. I mean, there are some repositories like Figshare, which is privately owned, and there are other repositories like Further, which is public and it's funded by the government. So I always like to encourage scientists of using open, free software, so software developed for the community, by the community, and I think that public repositories like Further or others, I can mention also Zenodo, are better choices for preserving data. But I think that's a little bit of my personal opinion because I'm personally against private companies taking profits from public funded science. But that's just my personal opinion.
Okay, great. Just a couple more questions I'd like to squeeze in.
Sure.
When data is gathered from sources, articles that originated behind paywalls, can the data be deposited in repositories? And how would that work? Does it have to be restricted?
In the following diapos, there's a very nice question, very nice answer to that specifically. Yeah. So we will get to that point.
And then are there specific legal ethical provisions for sharing anonymized, such as medical data for patients, if it was not explicitly mentioned in the consent form signed by patients that data could be shared with other researchers?
Definitely, there's those restricted access data. That's some other story, specifically when it came from humans. We at the Alliance, we have an initiative which is developing right now, a pilot project to incorporate restricted access data in our repository, but specifically, if you have not mentioned that the data will be published in a public repository, I think it makes an extreme difficult case for publish it because it should be in the informed consent.
Excellent. And then are JSON and YAML acceptable formats for the README file? I'm looking for a format that's both human readable and parsable by a computer. And for the README section, what is the maximum length for a dataset title?
For the README, the best format is TXT. JSON, XML are not good formats because are mostly machine readable but not human readable. TXT is both human and machine readable. JSON files and XML files will be generated by the repositories after you publish the data set. The repository will capture a lot of metadata and will organize that in JSON or XML files that perhaps you can later export. But the best gold standard format is a TXT, plain text, and there's no limit of it. So the limit of the README file, it doesn't matter. The limit of the title, question was specifically to the title, it doesn't matter neither.
Excellent, thanks. And just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded, everyone, so will be shared afterwards. Daniel, I'll pass it back over to you, understanding we have about 5 minutes left. We can maybe push to 5 minutes after, but we're nearing time.
Cool.
Thank you.
So this summarizes most of the principles to keep in mind when submitting data to repositories like Further. It's important that we have folders organized, folders and files organized, that we use naming conventions consistent and descriptive, that we prioritize open formats like CSV and TIFFs, and that we provide documentation as complete as possible. Question that may emerge for many of you: when should I start organizing my data? The better, the sooner. The sooner the better. Sorry. 4 or 5 sharing data after 4 or 5 years of chaotic data management is extremely tricky. When do I share my data? At any point in the research process. Indeed, you can share your data before publishing a research article and simply cite your data set in your research article. In that way, the data set and the contents of the data set are open to the public. What if my data does not fit into protocols like Tier 4? You can create a logical structure and document the data set as best as you can. Is the data set citable? Of course, it gets a DOI and it can be cited as an independent object. And in fact, as I said, you can even cite your data set in your research article. How others can use the data set, that depends on the license. We recommend CC BY4 license, which allows broad reuse of the data. And where can you share the data set? There are many repositories. Here in Canada, we have especially Further and Borealis. So we can say that as a data set is an independent research object that can be used and cited independently of the research article. And I encourage you to think about this in this way. Think of articles as the supplements of your data set. The most important research object is not the article, is the data set. So what's up with Further? So these are, this is the repository I work for, and we do our best to ensure that the data we receive is discoverable, reusable, and preserved in the long term. In Further, you can submit data from any discipline, and it will be curated by people like me to ensure that it incorporates open science and fair principles as much as possible. So when you submit data to our repository, you ensure the data is accessible and reusable in the long term. You will receive feedback from us to support on good data management practices and how to make your data as fair as possible. And I want to highlight that at Further, we deal with large data sets that can be terabytes of size. and we are always willing to definitely talk to researchers to attend the requirements in relation to data storage. We also have Borealis, which is specific for certain institutions here in Canada. As you can see here in the map, some institutions had access to the Borealis network. And different to further, different to further, Borealis have some interesting tools, which, like for example, the preview file, the data explorer tool, and some GitHub integration that can be suitable or important for many scientists. And here you can find the link to both repositories. And I'm glad we make it to the end. Here's some additional information about the Alliance and the services we provide. This QR code will guide you to our GitHub repository when you find the presentations in French and English. And if we have some time, I'm open for comments, questions. If not, we are always available at Further for discussion and support your research needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, so much. So there's just a couple more questions that have come in. So again, understanding that some people have very tight schedules. If you need to head out, thank you so much for joining us. The session will be recorded and distributed afterwards. Those of you who would like to stick around for a few more minutes, we can address those questions. So thank you very much. So we have one question here. Can you provide names of public repositories?
Yes, for sure. We have Further and Borealis in Canada. These two repositories are specific for Canadian institutions or researchers in Canadian institutions, but more generally, we also have Zenodo, which is sustained by the government of Switzerland. And we also have in America the OSF, the Open Science Framework Repository. So those are the repositories that come to my mind in this moment and are the ones that I personally use for my own research and my own endeavors.
Thank you. Another question here. Do you have any idea if and when restricted data will be accepted in FRDR following the pilot project?
We can evaluate that possibility for sure. So the pilot project now is working with some specific researchers, specifically at the University of Montreal, and basically establishing a straightforward and compelling workflow to have restricted access data. So you can always get in touch with us and we can make a consultation to see if the data set is suitable for further, but please do not hesitate to reach to us.
Great. And we have one more question here. So when data is gathered from sources, articles that originated behind paywalls, can the data be deposited in repositories, and how does that work?
Yeah, as I explained some minutes ago, I think it's better to do it the opposite way. So you publish your data set and then you publish your research article. In that way, you don't have any problem with copyrights and you give back enormous value to the scientific community and to the public. The right thing is, of course, to cite the data set inside your research article. So basically, in the research article, you are saying that you are using for these results data in this citation, in this DOI, and if to that DOI you give a CC BY license, you can share them without any problem. If you already published the research article, that may be a little bit trickier, but I think it will be possible because as my understanding goes, when these companies take the copyright for the research, they do not do so specifically for the raw data that back up the conclusions of the research article. So I think it's still possible, but that's something we can look specifically in any case.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you to everyone who has joined us here today. Thank you to our two language interpreters who have allowed for this session to be available both in English and in French. We hope that this session has been worthwhile for you and that you've taken something away. Daniel, based on the comments we were seeing here in the chat, this looks like this was a very successful session. Congratulations. Thanks again, everyone. Wishing you a great end of day and looking forward to see you again in the next session. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.